there now need be no secrecy.
The base is linked to huge satellites that suck up vast amounts of digital data from electronic sources.
The Joint Defence Facility at Pine Gap tracks mobile phones and email traffic to locate targets anywhere in the world.
Analysts at Pine Gap can find a target by seeking the signals and location of their communications, like mobile phones, firing that information to military centres in the US. From there, it can be sent to commanders in the battlefield.
The Pine Gap Surveillance Base in Central Australia plays a crucial role in US military action around the world.
The Australian Secret Intelligence Service, ASIO officers, work undercover as spies.
Australians have details of their lives recorded by ASIO surveillance.
Gough Whitlam and the whole party were deeply sceptical about ASIO.
Mr Whitlam will announce an inquiry into all our intelligence services.
Authorities discovered a tangled web of intrigue and the Central Intelligence Agency.
Well, may we say, God save the Queen, because nothing will save the Governor-General.
This is Gough Whitlam, the first and only Australian Prime Minister to be removed from office by the Governor-General. Official history teaches us that he was sacked because he couldn't get the budget supply bill through. Official history leaves a few things out. This is the CIA, the agency responsible for covertly toppling world governments that don't align with US interests. This is ASIO, one of Australia's most vital intelligence agencies. This is MI6, one of Britain's most vital intelligence agencies. This is my hometown of Alice Springs. 28 kilometres away is Pine Gap, a secret US-owned spy base. This is my current home, Perth, home to several foreign-owned mining companies. But what does MI6, the former ASIO headquarters, as well as these companies and my hometown, have to do with the removal of an Australian Prime Minister? Did the CIA remove Gough Whitlam from office? Let's find out. The official story is that an idealist reformist was removed from government by the Governor-General because of the expediency of his scandalous government. But let's go back to the start. Who is Gough Whitlam? Edward Gough Whitlam was born in Melbourne, 1916, moving to Sydney with his parents at the age of 2. During World War II, Gough Whitlam served as an air navigator in the Royal Australian Air Force. Shortly after, he entered politics and joined the Labor Party. Whitlam came from the Labor Right faction of the Labor Party, which was more in favour of free markets as opposed to the Victorian left. Whitlam himself was a larger-than-life character. He was as compassionate as he was ruthless. He was brilliant and arrogant, humorous and self-deprecating, but most importantly, he was ambitious. He had a new vision for Australia. But what kind of world would Gough inherit? Let's go back a bit. Post-World War II, two ideologically opposed superpowers clash in a cosmic battle, the US and the Soviet Union. Both of these superpowers would subvert elections, fund militia groups, and fight secret wars across the world. The Soviet Union's Comintern was an international organization aimed at spreading the means of world communism. Its counterpart was the CIA. The Central Intelligence Agency effectively works as the US's henchman. This agency alone has been solely responsible for toppling world governments that don't align with US interests. Its agents have done this by subverting elections and toppling democratically elected leaders all around the globe, all with plausible deniability. There have been over 72 CIA interventions around the globe minimum. The US have barely admitted to a fifth of these interventions. The CIA have influenced elections and overthrown governments in countries like Iran 1953, Guatemala 1954, Congo 1960, Chile 1973, Chad 1982, just to name a few. And in the 80s, the CIA were involved in worldwide drug smuggling in order to finance their secret wars. In 1953, the Iranian president took back control of Iran's oil reserves, which were largely being dominated by US-backed petroleum companies. He was then removed by the CIA. In 1954, the Guatemalan president, Arbenz, introduced a series of land reforms that threatened the business interests of the US-owned United Fruit Company. He was then removed by the CIA. In 1960, the Congolese Prime Minister and independence leader, Patrice Lumumba, went against US interests. The CIA had him killed. One of Whitlam's party predecessors, Ben Chifley, was already undergoing a mass campaign within his own party to crack down against communist infiltration within the Labour Party. According to this ASIO book, The Official History of ASIO, we already know that multiple KGB operatives were already operating within Australia's borders during the Cold War, and that the Soviet Union's Comintern was secretly funding the Communist Party of Australia. In turn, their members secretly infiltrated many of Australia's trade unions as well as the Labour Party. The concerned Chifley employed the Catholic Church in order for them to befriend the Labour Party and counter communist influence within the party. But why clean up the unions? Why was Chifley concerned about this? Because the Labour Party was largely backed by unions at this point, and whoever controls the unions controls the Labour Party. According to this book, Paul Keating's Interrupted Revolution, the pro-Comintern leaders within the party managed to infiltrate the ironworkers, the clerks, and the railway unions. Keep an eye on this, because the unions will be very important much later. Prime Minister Ben Chifley also created ASIO, Australia's secret intelligence agency. And speaking of Ben Chifley, he also wanted to prevent another economic Great Depression from ever occurring. In doing so, he attempted to rein in the power of the Australian banking system, but was removed from office by Australia's most powerful banks, by the bank-funded media who conspired to take him down in an anti-Chifley propaganda campaign. Now let's move on to one of his party successors, Gough Whitlam. Even before Gough Whitlam's rise to power, ASIO was incredibly wary of a Whitlam government ever coming to power. Members of Whitlam's government already had preconceived resentment against the agency for supposedly doing one-sided political targeting. Whitlam himself already had preconceived resentment against the CIA and by virtue the US and ASIO for meddling in the affairs of world leaders abroad. Fun fact, ASIO had covertly set up a secret organisation within the South Australian government at this time. This secret government had covertly kept files on Labour members and union officials. A lot of these secret files had damaging information on political leaders that ASIO and the CIA had unfavourable bias against. ASIO had a very close relationship with the CIA. Whatever the US's concerns were became the CIA's concerns. Whatever the CIA's concerns were became ASIO's concerns. In 1976, the Australian Royal Commission in Intelligence and Security found that the ASIO administration kept and passed files onto the CIA regarding damaging political information on leaders that they did not find favourable. This report found that the ASIO administration were actually assisting in secret the US in its operations within Cambodia, Indonesia, and Vietnam. The US administration had been concerned about Whitlam even before he came to power. Everything from his desire for a more independent Australian foreign policy, to he and his party's concerns about US installations on Australian soil, to his recognition of Communist China even before Nixon's recognition, all made the US mark Whitlam as a red flag. However, with somewhat successful political manoeuvring, Whitlam managed to evade the suspicions of the US against him and get into power. Ironically, Whitlam was one of the most moderate and most pro-US leaders within his party. And speaking of which, Whitlam's party had been in the wilderness and out of power for 23 consecutive years. But then, Australia decided it was time.
Our program has three great aims: to promote equality, to involve the people of Australia in the decision-making processes of our land, and to liberate the talents and uplift the horizons of the Australian people.
Time for freedom, time for moving, it's time to begin, yes it's time, time for better days to be here, it's time to move, yes it's time.
Authorised M. Young, Ainsley Avenue, Canberra.
Whether you agreed with him or not, the weight of his many reforms built modern Australia and changed the country forever.
Medibank, the new Australian health insurance program.
I want to promise you, your fight was not for yourselves alone, and I want to give back to you ownership of this land of your fathers.
My predecessor, Ben Chifley, spoke of the light on the hill, but it is essential now for us to set it aflame again.
From day one of the Whitlam government, Gough had butt heads with the nation's security apparatus by ordering ASIO not to vet or harass any ministers of his government. This was such a radical change in procedure that both alarmed the CIA and ASIO after ASIO had informed them of this. And a CIA officer warned one of Whitlam's advisors that the US would threaten to cut off all intelligence material sharing between the US and Australia. Whitlam's first sin committed against the Americans was his decision to speak out against the Vietnam War. This war cost the lives of over 200,000 Allied troops, 400,000 civilian deaths, and sparked an era of deep disillusionment between the US government and its anti-establishment youth. Whitlam comes in, he brings the troops back home, he abolishes conscription, and releases young men who were jailed for opposing military service. What really began to aggravate the US was Whitlam's criticisms of Nixon's bombings of Hanoi and Haiphong. Whitlam's ministers threw insults at Washington. They even encouraged strikes and anti-war protests. US officials responded shocked and angered at the Whitlam government. Whitlam even threatened to urge other countries to protest against US bombings. To add more fuel to the flames, Whitlam sent an urgent letter to Washington DC scolding Nixon for his bombing campaign. Nixon and Kissinger were enraged, and the US-Australian alliance almost collapsed. In outrage of the US bombings of Vietnam, Australian maritime unions placed an all-out ban on all US shipping to Australia. Other unions even halted all work on US commercial interests in Australia. That included US defence installations. The US Security Council by this point was deeply alarmed. The CIA was even more worried about Whitlam's deputy PM, Jim Cairns. This was regarding everything from Cairns' anti-Vietnam War stance to his critique of US bases on Australian soil. So in response, ASIO tried to discredit Cairns by leaking sensitive material about Cairns to the press twice, inferring that he was somehow a threat to national security. See, Whitlam was a maverick. At the UN, for example, Whitlam called out both the US and the Soviet Union for meddling in the affairs of other countries. Kissinger said to then keep Whitlam in line. Whitlam even had a proposal for a quote, zone of peace between major regional powers, etc. Kissinger and Nixon saw this as dangerous. Nixon completely cut off all diplomatic communication with Whitlam entirely. In 1966, America installs a secret base at the centre of Australia, in my hometown as a matter of fact.
Pine Gap in the Northern Territory was an absolutely vital cog in the CIA's spy satellite network.
Officially it is a joint facility with Australia, but this is a cover. It was planned, set up and run by the CIA as the eavesdropping capital of the world.
This base was such a crucial chess piece in order to spy on their Cold War enemies. The base also transmitted communication signals, civilian and military. It intercepted information, and it helped plan and coordinate military strikes, including potential nuclear strikes. But the Australian government was completely in the dark on what the purpose of these bases were.
There are 12 principal American facilities in Australia, of which these 3 at Narunga, Pine Gap and Northwest Cape are among the most secret and important strategic bases in the world.
Now, Whitlam's government comes in and he states that the Australian government will honour pre-existing agreements regarding the lease of the base. However, he did say to US ambassador that, quote, try to screw us or bounce us and the matter of the bases will become of contention. This statement alone put the US on high alert. Leaked files from the Australian Defence Department revealed that the US installations on Australian soil were being used to bomb civilians in Cambodia and targets in Vietnam, all without the consent or awareness of the Australian government. During the Arab-Israeli War in 1973, US bases were put on nuclear alert, including the ones in Australia, all without Whitlam's knowledge. Whitlam eventually found out about all of this, and he was furious. The head of the Defence Department in Australia had deceived him about the true purpose of Pine Gap. Even worse, Pine Gap made Australia a nuclear target for the Soviet Union and Communist China.
Australians had been made prime Soviet targets and they didn't know it. There was no early warning, no protection.
After these revelations, Whitlam was hellbent on shutting down US bases in Australia. Whitlam storms into Parliament in April 1974 and threatens not to renew the leases of US spy bases within Australia, including Pine Gap. Whitlam's threat alone caused the hairs of the CIA's back to stand on the US-Australian cables. Going back to my hometown, there are a lot of Americans in Alice Springs. Usually they're ex-army personnel that move on to work at the base, and whenever they're asked about what their job is, they've been instructed to say that they are quote-unquote gardeners at the base. My current stepfather and my dad's best friend both worked at Pine Gap. The base can spy on anyone in town. The town's economy is propped up by this base's existence. The government subsidises some town businesses to stay open in order to accommodate base personnel. Without this base, I probably wouldn't exist. And during the Iraq War, Pine Gap was brimming with activity. And to think that the drone strikes, the Andrew Wilkie drama, CIA operations, and the whole Whitlam drama all stemmed from 18 kilometres away from where I went to primary school. Enter Christopher Boyce.
Christopher Boyce worked here in a top secret installation. This is where they build satellites for the CIA, including the black satellites that spy on Russia and China and use Pine Gap as a relay station for sending information back here to the United States. Now, within TRW, the most highly classified area was a place called the Black Vault. That was a room where they kept the messages and the codes.
From witnessing the communications chatter, Boyce had several findings. That the US was hiding certain information from Australia that went against the joint US-Australian agreement to share intelligence, that Pine Gap was being used to monitor certain phone calls and messages to and from Australia, that the CIA had actually infiltrated some of Australia's trade unions, and that the CIA had funded the opposition parties of Australia.
Christopher Boyce telling what he knows about the CIA and its meddling in Australian politics. But he goes on to mention other disturbing events, including CIA infiltration of Australian unions.
What kicked this all off was deceptions by my government against yours. What was going on in Australia, what the twixes I saw concerning your labor unions. In this particular instance, we had hardware, software, and personnel to ship out to Alice Springs, and there was worry over strikes at your airports. They had to do with pilots and air controllers. Strikes would wreck our schedule. And so in this one instance, a twix came from Pilot, which said, Pilot will continue to suppress the strikes, continue shipment on schedule.
So Pilot was the CIA headquarters at Langley?
Langley, Virginia, yes. Intelligence directly or through intermediaries infiltrated the hierarchy of your trade unions at some level.
But when the bases are being used to send messages back and forth by the CIA on how to better subvert the Australian government by influencing labor unions, when the bases are used to domestically interfere with the Australian regime, then I don't think the Australians are getting a fair deal.
Boyce saw many messages relayed to and from Pine Gap, but one name came up in particular. Australia's Governor-General, John Kerr. Now, because Australia is a constitutional monarchy, the position of Governor-General is meant to represent the British Crown. Now, this position is very powerful, especially because the Governor-General can use reserve powers to dismiss the sitting Prime Minister out of office. Sir John Kerr, during World War II, he joined Australia's counterintelligence agency. He was later transferred to America's agency in Washington, the OSS. That later became the CIA.
The CIA chief at TRW, a man named Mr. Joe Harrison, referred to the Australian Governor-General as our man Kerr.
TRW in the Rowley Project, they call Mr. Kerr our man Kerr.
What, the CIA man said that?
Yes, Joe Harrison said that in the security area. One time I ever heard that.
Kerr also had ties to an organisation called the Australian Association for Cultural Freedom. In 1967, this organisation was exposed in Congress for being, quote, founded, funded, and generally run by the CIA. Kerr also had ties to an association called the Asia Foundation, which, according to former CIA officer Victor Marchetti, was a cover for clandestine operations, as well as to promote the spread of anti-communist and pro-American ideas. This organization was exposed in Congress for being a CIA conduit for money and influence. Quote, the CIA paid for Kerr's travel, they built his prestige, and Kerr continued to go to the CIA for money.
Closely associated with two organizations exposed in Congress, one as CIA funded, the other as a CIA front.
When President Nixon and Henry Kissinger overthrew the democratically elected government of Chile in 1973, it was revealed that ASIS agents secretly collaborated with the CIA to destabilize the country. When Whitlam found out, he was furious and ordered all operations in Chile to be halted. However, in secret, ASIS members continued to operate within Chile. In 1973, Whitlam revealed the existence of an Australian signals unit in Singapore. This base was actually a front for the CIA and ASIO. It monitored civilian and military activity in Asia and around the globe. Whitlam then shut it down. He also spoke against US plans to build a nuclear military outpost in Diego Garcia. This only further agitated the CIA. According to Killing Hope, Whitlam fired the head of ASIS in 1975 because it was revealed that the agency was secretly collaborating with the CIA to overthrow the government of East Timor. During this period, Whitlam and his ministers actually resented ASIO because of their perceived ideological bias against certain groups over others. For example, ASIO would heavily target communists, but would remain very quiet on Croatian terrorist groups within the country. I mean, just for example, in the late 60s, a Croatian separatist group performed multiple terrorist attacks on Australian soil.
In September 2 years ago, when 2 time bombs exploded in the Sydney offices of a Yugoslav tourist agency, a new wave of controversy started about ASIO's activities.
A Croatian nationalist terror attack and a series of intelligence leaks led to criticism of ASIO that it had become too ideological.
Extensive damage was done in this explosion.
Whitlam suspected ASIO of withholding crucial information from the government, especially in regards to the Croatian terrorist group within the country. So in response, Whitlam ordered a police raid on the ASIO headquarters. Whitlam's Attorney General, Lionel Murphy, used the federal police to storm into the headquarters of the ASIO and retrieve crucial files. This deeply alarmed ASIO and placed the CIA on high alert. High-ranking CIA officer James Angleton was deeply concerned about Murphy's actions that day and, quote, the CIA genuinely considered breaking all intelligence relations with Australia. This is where Gough Whitlam signs his death warrant. For a very long time, Whitlam was deeply concerned about the fact that the profits from Australia's mining resources were being funneled into the large US-owned foreign mining corporations operating within Australia. British and American companies were taking over many Australian firms and increasing their profit share for themselves. However, Whitlam wanted to buy back a majority of Australia's own natural resources so Australia could make a profit share from our own resources.
If you took all the land owned by foreign interests, it would add up to a strip that runs from Cape York to Sydney and include the whole of Victoria. The Australian Labor Party can't undo the past, but it could control the future, so that we never get to be paying guests in our own country.
Written, spoken and authorised, E.G. Whitlam for the Australian Labor Party.
But he poked the bear, because US corporations firmly believed that Whitlam supposedly put at risk $5 billion worth of US economic investment in Australia. Whitlam's actions alarmed many US businessmen on Wall Street. Here's where it gets serious. In 1974, Nixon commissioned a secret report into the prospects of US economic investment within Australia and came to a scary conclusion that Whitlam's mining policies were a threat to US business interests in Australia. Clearly, something needed to be done. According to Holy Fury, out of this report came a couple of considerations. One of these considerations was an option that called for the White House to, quote, apply selective pressures on Whitlam if necessary by inducing domestic tensions in the Labour government, creating public discontent, subsequently securing opposition victory. But you may be wondering, where does the British Crown fit into all of this? What's their aim? Well, remember in 1953, when the Prime Minister of Iran took back control of the country's own oil resources, which were primarily being dominated by Western petroleum companies. So, the CIA and MI6 teamed up to overthrow him and remove him from power. 50% of the profit share of Iran's oil resources was split between France, the US, and the UK. In this period, Britain had large financial interests in Rio Tinto and its mining operations within Australia. This was all threatened when Whitlam wanted to reassert Australia's control of its own natural resources. Britain's intelligence agency, MI6, also had a vested interest against Whitlam's policies regarding foreign bases on Australian soil. We must remember at this time, MI6 actually secretly operated a base on Australian soil along with ASIO as a joint venture operation between these two agencies. The base's activities were even concealed from the Australian government. These activities included covert operations in Asia, as well as the interception of other people's communications. Because of Whitlam's attack on the sanctity of these bases, the number of calls between ASIO and MI6 between 1974 and 5 doubled. Senior MI5 officer Peter Wright was personally angry at Whitlam for firing the head of ASIO, Peter Barber. You see, MI5 had a plan to transform Australia into a counter-espionage consultant. This plan was greenlit by the head of ASIO, Peter Barber, but because Whitlam had fired him, the plans of MI5 were foiled. So, a plan hatched. MI5's Peter Wright, along with the CIA's counterintelligence officer, James Angleton, began to conspire against Whitlam. This is crucial. A statement from Whitlam says that the Brits were decoding secret messages coming into the Foreign Affairs Office, and they made an attack on him because, quote, they hoped he would crack.
They threatened to cut off intelligence relations because Whitlam was a security threat.
The media is another weapon that powerful interests use to destroy a subversive figure. Whitlam had actually become a threat to the infamous media mogul, Rupert Murdoch. This was especially after Whitlam's ownership mining policies had actually threatened a joint venture project between Murdoch and BHP. Murdoch and BHP had planned to actually build an aluminium metals refinery together. In early 1975, Murdoch sent a single memo to his editors. The memo read, quote, "Kill Whitlam." Thus, a mass media smear campaign was propagated against Whitlam by Murdoch. Simultaneously, Murdoch's papers backed the opposition, Malcolm Fraser. Even more astonishingly, in the 1980s, senior CIA officers revealed that the, quote, Whitlam problem was discussed with great urgency between the head of MI6 and the director of the CIA. Whitlam's ministers knew that, quote, MI6 was bugging cabinet meetings for the Americans. Everything came to a head. Everything from Whitlam's policies towards US bases, to Vietnam, to Whitlam's mining policies, pushed Nixon to do something drastic. Nixon sends senior US diplomat Marshall Green to Australia to become ambassador to the country. In reality, he was sent to Australia to, quote, sort out the Whitlam problem. Marshall Green had two nicknames: the troubleshooter and the coup master. Marshall Green had been a key head in the US-backed coup to remove the Indonesian president and replace him with a leader who then allowed foreign powers to have access to the country's mining resources. Now, he was in Australia. One of Whitlam's ministers suggested to Green about the possibility of Australia taking back control of its own mining resources. Marshall Green's response was, quote, "Oh, we'll move in." In a speech in 1974 given by Green to Australian American business leaders, Green stated that business leaders could expect help from the United States, similar to that given in South America. The Governor General, Sir John Kerr, received several important secret briefings from Marshall Green, everything involving CIA ASIO reports to Whitlam's subversive actions and other upcoming crises. Remember Whitlam's ambitious plan to buy back Australian mining resources from the US-owned mining corporations operating in Australia? This was called, quote, buying back the farm. So in order to do this, Whitlam needed majority shares in these companies, and Whitlam needed to purchase these shares through a massive loan. Now, unfortunately, the Australian Treasury was stacked with many opponents to this very plan. Whitlam then sent 2 ministers of his to scour the globe looking for any loans whatsoever. Now, this is where Cairns and Connor both went wrong. They did not go through the Loans Council, and they did not inform Treasury about getting the loan. Now, this led to a massive scandal, and this scandal led to the pretext in which the Whitlam government was to be dismissed. However, there is way more to this story. The official story is that the Whitlam government tried to secure an unapproved loan from a Pakistani banker named Tirath Kemlani. However, what is heavily omitted from Australian conventional history is this. According to John Pilger's A Secret Country, Kemlani was a corrupt con man and a CIA-linked banker. So the story goes that Kemlani was actually sent to talk to Connor by a Hong Kong arms firm. This arms firm was closely linked with Commerce International. Commerce International was a multinational bank with widespread links to arms dealing as well as the CIA. So Connor was promised a loan by Kemlani, but Kemlani kept stalling and the loan was never actually processed. Now, if we skip ahead to 1975, Deputy PM Jim Cairns was introduced to a Melbourne businessman. Harris had told Cairns about a $4 billion loan available at a 2.5% brokerage fee. Harris had shown Cairns a letter verifying the loan offer, which came from Commerce International. Cairns had actually rejected the offer, so the best Cairns could do was give Harris a letter of interest in finding a loan, but no commitments were made, and Cairns walked out of the deal afterwards. To Cairns' shock, Harris publicly released a letter with Jim Cairns' supposed signature on it agreeing to the loan. One problem, Cairns never came to an agreement nor signed a signature. It was a setup. But the opposition used this against Cairns when they accused him of misleading Parliament, and he was ultimately forced to resign. One ASIO officer even publicly claimed that, quote, that some of the forgeries that helped discredit the Labour government in its final year in office were forgeries planted by the CIA. The CIA even reported it in its own national intelligence daily publication that, quote, some of the evidence against Cairns had been fabricated. Another evidence plant appeared in a 1975 Australian media report that one mercantile bank had issued a letter seeking apparently, quote, $1.2 billion in a loan on behalf of the Australian government. One problem, Whitlam's ministers had never even heard of this loan, but that didn't matter. This report destroyed any ostensible credibility that Whitlam's government had at the time. Interestingly enough, this bank was formed by one Colonel Paul Helliwell. He had worked for the CIA's predecessor, the OSS. Helliwell had funded the CIA invasion of Cuba in 1961, among other CIA covert activities. The rabbit hole goes even deeper. In 1981, a CIA contract employee had claimed that he had forged some of the loans affair cables and had even bugged a hotel room that Whitlam was staying in. This CIA contract employee had proclaimed to be paid by Nugan Hand Bank. This bank was caught up in everything from money laundering, arms dealing, funding covert CIA operations around the globe, and even drug smuggling across Indochina.
The CIA has involved itself in illegal activities. Some to date involve a bank in Australia known as Nugan Hand.
And hardly any of its top people were bankers. Many were former high-ranking military officers with ties to U.S. intelligence. When they found the body of Australian businessman Frank Nugan, the bank's chairman, shot to death a few months before the bank went under, they discovered in his pocket the business card of this man, William Colby, former director of the CIA.
The idea was that money would be deposited with the Nugan Hand Bank by the CIA.
The CIA made millions and used the money to finance some of its secret projects.
A former Nugan Hand Bank employee provided evidence that the CIA had funded $2.4 million to the opposition parties following Whitlam's election in 1973.
The Nugan Hand affair has caused an uproar in Australia, where authorities are trying to find out what involvement the bank might have had in the 1975 downfall of the Labour Party government.
But back to Khemlani. It doesn't matter that some of the evidence against Whitlam's government was actually forged by the CIA, because it worked. To the opposition and the press and the public, it looked like Whitlam's government was ridden in scandal. Even worse, a cascade of parliamentary events gave the opposition the upper hand against Whitlam. He no longer had a majority in the Senate. This meant that Whitlam needed the approval of Fraser's opposition to pass through any government bill through legislation. Fraser could choose to block any of Whitlam's legislation. This included the supply bill. This bill gave permission to the government to be able to spend any kind of money whatsoever. Fraser held this at ransom. Even worse, Khemlani even travelled to Australia and did two things. He revealed that Connor kept secretly contacting him even though he promised to stop looking for foreign loans. Whitlam was then forced to fire Connor. But after that, Khemlani even accused Whitlam himself of being in on the loans affair the entire time, even after it was banned, but no evidence was provided. That didn't matter. It was good enough for Fraser. He then blocked supply, citing the loans affair for the main reason. This meant that Whitlam's government was unable to spend any funds whatsoever, and eventually their money supply dried out. The Senate never used power like this in its 74 years of existence. But why would the opposition rush so quickly to do such a high-risk move? Instead, why not just wait for the scandalous Whitlam government to fall apart in the next 6 months in time for the next election? Because 6 months was too long a wait. The renewal of the Pine Gap Treaty was due in under 2 months on December 9th. At this time, the CIA station chief in London contacted the MI6 to discuss the quote, Whitlam problem. The CIA station chief full well knew what was the cost if Pine Gap was shut down.
There was definitely conversations in the Black Vault and in the security area about the problem of Mr. Whitlam, about the base. Mr. Whitlam was wanting to know what was going on there, and by publicizing it was compromising the integrity of the project.
Even though the bases were in Australia?
Yes, Mr. Whitlam's government was a threat.
In Washington, this was seen as a direct threat to American global power, and the CIA took action.
In that same year, the CIA director and the head of the MI6 sought help from both MI6 and MI5 officers based in Washington. What was concluded from this meeting was that, quote, if this intelligence capability was lost, then the alliance would be in danger and blinded strategically. The CIA director, William Colby, said that the threat posed by the Whitlam government was one of the greatest crises of his intelligence career. In November, it was revealed to the press that a man by the name of Richard Stallings had been channeling funds to the opposition party leader Doug Anthony. It turns out Stallings was a CIA officer. However, Whitlam was told by the defense establishment that Stallings was not a CIA officer at all. So Whitlam then demanded for a list of all declared and undeclared CIA officers operating within the country. Stallings' name was on that list. Stallings, as it turned out, happened to be the CIA officer who established Pine Gap. Enraged, Whitlam went to Parliament on November 2nd and accused the opposition of being CIA funded. Doug Anthony admitted that he was friends with Stallings, but then challenged Whitlam to provide evidence that Stallings even worked for the CIA. Well, when Parliament was to return on November 11th, Whitlam planned to reveal the identities of unregistered CIA agents operating in Australia and expose Stallings as an agent. The Defense Department became frantic because Whitlam was going to expose the cover of the man who set up Pine Gap, as well as reveal that this base was run by the CIA, threatening the very future of its existence. And so the CIA decided, it's time.
The Central Intelligence Agency.
Former CIA officer Victor Marchetti said that, quote, a kind of Chile coup was set in motion. On November 10th, a very crucial day, Whitlam was informed by the new head of ASIO that the agency received an urgent message from Washington. Quote, the Australian Prime Minister was a security risk within his own country. Now, this message was dictated by a man named Theodore Shackley.
Shackley was the CIA's covert action expert. His record of intervention in other countries stretched from Cuba to Vietnam to Chile.
Shackley was hysterical about Whitlam's threat, which would, quote, blow off the lid of those installations in Australia like Pine Gap. Another CIA source stated that, quote, on November 9th, one civil servant floated the CIA's concerns of Shackley's message to one Sir John Kerr. On that day, Kerr travelled to one of Australia's spy agencies. There, he was briefed on a, quote, security crisis and was briefed on the phone on a secure line for at least 20 minutes. November 11th arrives, the very day that Whitlam was to inform Parliament about secret bases in the country and expose US agents on Australian soil. He was summoned by the Governor-General and sacked by John Kerr.
Just 2 days before a federal parliamentary debate was due on the American satellite bases, a CIA telex arrived in Canberra. It warned that Prime Minister Whitlam was in danger of blowing the lid off Pine Gap. The next day, the Whitlam Labor government was dismissed.
The Governor-General had dissolved Parliament and had accepted the budget supply bill. Malcolm Fraser was made caretaker Prime Minister. Here is a final quote from the man who previously ran Pine Gap, former CIA officer Victor Marchetti. He said that, quote, the CIA's aim was to get rid of a government they did not like and that was not cooperative. It's a Chile but in a more sophisticated and subtle form. It was a setup.
What are some of the specific examples you would give to substantiate that?
Well, how about a call from the CIA to MI5, MI6, saying we have a security problem in Australia. We have a security problem with the Prime Minister. He is endangering national security for the United States and the alliance. The evidence is that he's making noises about our bases. He's making threats. Those bases are absolutely essential to the survival of the alliance. That plants a seed in the British intelligence community.
Are you saying that such a call took place?
Absolutely. More than one call. Dozens of calls. It became a part of the policy.
You have it on good authority that those calls
I have it
took
on
place.
authority at the highest levels of the U.S. intelligence community. And in a way, it allowed a duly elected prime minister to be tossed out of office. It's a little scary, really, when you think about it.
And for the final smoking gun, in 1977, 1 to 2 years after the dismissal, the US Deputy Secretary of State Warren Christopher travelled to Sydney to meet with Gough Whitlam on behalf of US President Jimmy Carter and told Whitlam, quote, the US would never again interfere with Australia's democratic processes. After Whitlam was removed, it was business as usual.
What is done in the exercise of the reserve powers is to make a political decision. I know what price I paid for what I did. I have no regrets about what I did because it was right.
In the last dying days of the Whitlam government, a young and ambitious future treasurer becomes energy minister under Whitlam's cabinet. On the day of the dismissal, one Paul Keating can be spotted next to Whitlam, handing him a microphone. On that same day, a charismatic head of the trade union movement, one Bob Hawke, can be seen addressing a crowd, pleading them not to strike out of anger for Whitlam. The dismissal would forever change these two underlings of Whitlam, especially because they both had a unique partnership with him. The future PM, Bob Hawke, became a consensus leader who played it safe with the Americans. Initially, in a 1977 news headline titled Hawke Suspects CIA of Sacking, in which Hawke called for an urgent public inquiry into, quote, the foreign interference in the domestic processes of Australia, Hawke since then has denied his statements. Why? In this period, Hawke had actually become friendly with several CIA-backed unions in Australia, as well as several senior CIA officials embedded within the union movement. The CIA infiltrated Australia's trade unions to stop them from becoming a threat. But what about future PM Paul Keating? Keating saw Whitlam as a mentor of his.
Australia should become a republic by the year 2001.
Those dopes in ISIS tapped his telephone. This is what states get up to if you let these security agencies ning-nongs take control. We are better left alone than we are being protected by an aggressive power like the United States.
Scarily enough, the CIA were keeping tabs on both Hawke and Keating, especially because the agency understood and recognised their future trajectory into power. And another democratically elected government is overthrown by the CIA. And not just any government, our government, Australia's government.
He's got a big bright spouse and a Sydney house and a map to show the Reds that Bondi's grouse. He rushes in where angels fear to go. He's a man of the soil, can get a billy to boil, and is sure to keep it up while his admin toil. He's a handsome, wild colonial man, but he'll join the bloody world if he possibly can.
Edward, Edward, Edward Gough Whitlam.
The adventures of Edward Gough Whitlam. Dinky-die time about the true blue boy, fresh from the years that he spent on his knees, walking the floor of the lodge with ease. From the land that thinks the whole world's out to get them, the adventures of Edward Gough Whitlam.
For a moment believe that we should set limits on what we can achieve together for our country, for our people, for our future.
Well, may we say, God save the Queen, because nothing will save the Governor-General.
Hey guys, thank you so much for watching. This video took a year to research. It's 2:05 AM. I haven't slept, but here's the trailer for my next video in a second. Well, this is for my next video. I'll see you guys in a year.
Fraser was to meet his own nemesis in Bob Hawke, who defeated him at the polls in 1983.
Australia's most dramatic day in politics since November the 11th, 1975.
Bob Hawke won in a landslide, defeating Malcolm Fraser in the 1983 election. In partnership with his brash treasurer, Hawke and Treasurer Paul Keating reformed many aspects of the economy.
This is one of the great partnerships in the history of Australian politics.
Any day now you will receive this envelope.
That every Australian can share in the cheapest and fairest health insurance scheme Australia's ever had.
Medicare.
Keating was responsible for the federal budget during a period of economic decline.
But by 1991, the world economy was tanking.
This is a recession that Australia had to have.
As the recession gripped, the Treasurer's popularity plummeted.
Hawke had pledged to step aside in favour of his ambitious treasurer. When that deadline passed, with Hawke showing no sign of bowing out, Keating launched a challenge.
Tonight, Paul Keating versus Bob Hawke. It looks to be on.
And the Prime Minister demanded a showdown with his treasurer.
I hope he's looking forward to it as much as I am.
Do you want his job, Mr. Pitt?
Keating toppled the Prime Minister.
We thank you. We won't let you down. Thank you.
Keating introduced compulsory superannuation to create a national retirement income scheme.
Little things, big things grow.
Industry super funds.
There was enormous potential for personal friction here, wasn't there?
But because the question of whether the country's greatest treasurer would succeed one of its greatest prime ministers